In the history of American Cosa Nostra, the threat of violence is just as important as its use, and nearly every member and associate in its history is capable. There are individuals, however, who stand out even among their peers in the underworld. These mobsters are the 30 most feared wise guys in American Cosa Nostra. Number 2. Bonanno family acting boss, Carmine Galante. Camillo Carmine Galante was born on February 21, 1910, in a tenement building in the East Harlem section of Manhattan. His parents, Vincenzo Galante and Vincenza Russo, had immigrated from the Castellamare del Golfo region of Sicily to New York in 1906. Carmine Galante had 2 brothers, Samuel and Peter, along with 2 sisters, Josephine and Angelina. Early life was tough for the Galante children. Poverty was rampant, and the streets of the poorest neighborhoods were controlled by violent gangs and extortionists. For young Carmine, it didn't take long to realize that the quickest way out of poverty was through criminal enterprise. At the age of 10, Galante was sent to reform school due to his criminal activities. During these early years, he would form a juvenile street gang on New York's Lower East Side, and like many immigrant children of the time, he would find work in 1923 when he was employed by Lubin Artificial Flower Company at 270 West Broadway. This was one of the many legitimate jobs he recorded over the years for tax purposes and for the benefit of his various parole officers. Galante had numerous arrests for assault and robbery, and on December 12, 1925, the 15-year-old Galante pled guilty to assault charges. On December 22, 1926, Galante was given a sentence of 2.5 to 5 years in state prison. Because he refused to cooperate with law enforcement, Galante earned respect and became known as a stand-up guy. Galante would be released from prison and took a job as a sorter at the O'Brien Fish Company at 105 South Street near the Fulton Fish Market. During these years of prohibition, he would also become a mafia associate, working as an enforcer by the end of the decade. In this capacity, Galante was required to use brute force against anyone who crossed the mafia or tried interfering in any mafia rackets. On the morning of Saturday, March 15, 1930, police officer Walter Di Castiglia reported for duty at the 84th Precinct House at 72 Poplar Street in Brooklyn Heights. He was a 9-year veteran with a young family who lived in Jamaica, Queens. The station sergeant sent him around to Martin Weinstein's shoe factory in the 7-story red brick building on the corner of York and Washington Streets to watch over the owner who was making up his factory payroll. Around midday, when Di Castiglia was sitting in an inner office on the 6th floor of the building with Weinstein, 4 gunmen burst into the main office and strode across to where the 2 men sat. As Officer Di Castiglia rose, reaching for his holstered revolver, he was struck twice in the chest and once in the leg by at least 6 shots. He died instantly. The gunman turned, walked back out of the office along the corridor to the elevator, where a 5th gunman was guarding Louis Sella, the lift operator. The men entered and went down to street level, casually walking to a parked car in which they drove off. At no time did any of the gunmen attempt to retrieve the small mountain of cash, totaling $7,500, that was stacked on the owner's desk. Sella described the gunmen being in their early to mid-20s, dark-complected with dark hair, and all well-dressed. Although a small army of uniformed officers and detectives descended on the scene, there was no trace of the gunmen to be found. It was first thought by investigators that the killing was personal, perhaps a grudge killing by one or more of the shooters, although this theory never developed legs. 5 months later, Carmine Galante would be arrested for the murder of the officer. He would later be released for a lack of evidence. Arrested along with Galante was 27-year-old Michael Consolo and his cousin, Angelo Presenzano. Consolo would go on to become Galante's bodyguard, while Presenzano became a top aide that stayed close to him right up until his death. He was also Galante's best man when he was married in 1945. That same year, he was caught along with other gang members by NYPD officer Joseph Minahan as they attempted to hijack a truck in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. A gun battle ensued, and Galante wounded Minahan, as well as a 6-year-old bystander, both of whom survived. Taken to the police station, he was worked over by a group of detectives and brutally beaten. He was later identified as one of a gang of 4 who had robbed the Lieberman Brewery in Brooklyn. He never admitted to anything, including the identities of his accomplices, and after trial, was sentenced by Judge Conway in Kings County Courthouse, Brooklyn, on January 8, 1931, to 12.5 years in state prison, where he remained until his release on May 1, 1939. While in prison, doctors diagnosed Galante as having a psychopathic personality. According to his FBI dossier, Galante had a mental age of 14.5 and an IQ of 90. He had no knowledge of current events, routine holidays, or other items of common knowledge. He was diagnosed as a neuropathic, psychopathic personality, emotionally dull, and indifferent, with prognosis as being poor. Upon his release from prison, he went back to his old job at the Lubin Artificial Flower Company. On February 3, 1941, after being sponsored by his elder brother Sam, he joined the local 856 of the Longshoremen's Union and for a time worked as a stevedore on Piers 14 and 21 for the New York and Cuba Steamship Company. Around this time, he started working for the Bonanno crime family, whose boss, Joseph Bonanno, also hailed from Castellammare del Golfo. Galante remained loyal to Bonanno throughout his career. In 1943, Galante made the mark that elevated his status to a rising star in the Mafia. Around this time, crime boss Vito Genovese had fled to Italy to escape murder charges. While there, Genovese tried to integrate himself with Italy's fascist prime minister, Benito Mussolini, by ordering the execution of Carlo Tresca, who published an anarchist newspaper in New York that was critical of the dictator. On January 11, 1943, Galante, possibly on the orders of Bonanno underboss Frank Garofalo, who had also been embarrassed by Tresca for having an affair with Assistant United States Attorney Dolores Faccianti, headed to Tresca's office on 15th Street around 9:45 p.m., just as Tresca was leaving for the day. Tresca and a friend crossed to the corner of 5th Avenue when a small man dressed in a brown overcoat ran down the street, shot Tresca twice, and then leaped into a waiting car that sped off west in the direction of Chelsea. 2 men employed by the Norwegian consulate were walking east on 15th Street and heard the shots. One of them, Mens von Erpicom, later described the car. He had served in the automobile corps of the Norwegian army, and he knew his motors. A .38 caliber revolver was found in the doorway of the 5th Avenue entrance to Tresca's office building, indicating a second killer was waiting there to cover the doorway. The gun was traced to Philadelphia, but there the trail went cold. Galante was never charged due to lack of evidence. All the police could do was link him to an abandoned car found near the murder scene. The hit on Tresca cemented Galante's reputation of violence within the New York underworld. It was a reputation that grew with every passing day. Finally, the parole authority had Galante recommitted to prison on November 23, 1943 for cohabitating with known criminals. Joseph Di Palermo was named specifically. However, just a year later, on December 21, 1944, he was released after months of lobbying and legal procedure work by a number of very high-powered and influential attorneys. He may have also been supported financially by donations from the American Labor Party, controlled by Luigi Antonini, who had formed an alliance with Generoso Pope, the head of the popular Italian newspaper Il Martero, published in New York City. Both men had seen Tresca as an obstruction to their political ambitions. There were also rumors floating around that the Teamsters Union funneled money through Joe Di Palermo to the Galante Defense Fund. At the relatively young age of 34, Carmine Galante had come of age in the Italian-American underworld. Some sources state he was taken directly under the wing of Joe Bonanno himself, the head of what the NYPD called the Castellamarese gang. On February 10, 1945, Galante married Helen Elena Marulli, who was 28 and lived on Shepherd's Avenue in Brooklyn. They were married at Our Lady of Sorrows Church on Pitt Street in the East Village. She had been his alibi the night Tresca was killed, confirming they both had been to the movies near Times Square, watching the new release Casablanca, then spending the rest of the evening at a hotel. They would separate later in life, but they would never divorce. Galante would later state that he never divorced her since he was a good Catholic. He lived for 20 years with a mistress, Anna Aquavella, who bore 2 of his 5 children. By the early 1950s, Carmine Galante had solidified his position in the Bonanno crime family. He would be arrested again on December 16, 1950, when the cops raided a crap game operating out of 235 West 18th Street in the Lower East End of Manhattan, arresting 51 people, including Galante, who was charged with operating the game. By now, he had acquired the nickname that would stick with him the rest of his life. Addicted to cigars, especially the big Cuban Presidente brand, he was hardly ever seen without one stuck in the side of his mouth. He became known as Lilo or Lilo, which can mean cigar or little cigar in Italian slang. At this time, the Bonanno crime family was one of the smaller of the 5 families of New York, but it was highly unified and well organized. Bonanno family boss Joe Bonanno's principal administration consisted of Frank Garofalo, John Tartamella, John Bonaventre, and Carmine Galante. Sometime in the early 1950s, Joseph Bonanno made the big decision to leap into the world of drug trafficking. He sent Galante north into Canada to establish a bridgehead in Montreal. In Montreal, Galante partnered with Luigi Greco and the Catroni brothers, Vic, Joe, and Frank. Calabrian-born Vic Catroni, who may have been the first mafia boss of the city, had an arrest record dating back to 1928. He became so close to Galante that he became godfather to one of his children. By 1954, Galante had developed such a power base in Montreal, he became one of the most powerful mobsters in the city. According to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Galante at this time had formed an alliance with John Ormento, a capo in the Lucchese crime family. They began moving massive amounts of drugs from Cuba and Montreal into New York, Chicago, and Dallas. By 1959, the Catroni brothers were supplying Galante and Ormento with up to 50 kilos of pure heroin a month. Carmine Galante and his lock on the heroin trafficking business brought huge rewards into the Bonanno family. Galante also brought from New York a professional criminal and ex-thief by the name of Earl Carluzzi to help him organize the unions for the hotels, restaurants, and nightclubs. Law enforcement in Montreal began to catch on, however, and in 1955, Galante would get deported from Montreal as an undesirable alien. He placed his wife's brother, Tony Marulli, in place to oversee his interests, but Marulli would be deported as well in 1956. During 1956 and 1957, agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics tracked Galante as he traveled from New York to Miami and in 1958 to Cuba to meet with French, Canadian, and American drug dealers. In 1957, Joseph Bonanno and Carmine Galante held a meeting of various mafia bosses, including the mafia godfather Lucky Luciano, at the Grand Hotel de Palmas in Palermo, Sicily. An agreement was reached where the Sicilian mob would smuggle heroin into the United States and the Bonannos would distribute. Galante recruited Sicilians from his hometown to act as bodyguards, contract killers, and enforcers. Galante trusted these Zips, as they were known, more than the American-born gangsters, due to his feeling that they were more entrenched in the mafia customs, most importantly, omertà. The Zips were also not constrained by the norms of the American mafiosos in that they had no qualms about using bombs and murdering family members, including women and children. In 1958 and again in 1960, Galante was indicted for narcotics trafficking. From the beginning, the first trial was characterized by jurors and alternates dropping out and coercive courtroom displays by the defendant. His first court proceeding in 1960 ended in a mistrial when the foreman of the jury broke his back in a mysterious fall inside an abandoned building. There was no question that he was pushed, said William Tendy, a former assistant U.S. attorney. After a second trial in 1962, Galante was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Galante, who was 52 at the time of his sentencing, seemed washed up, but he plotted to come back in a big way. Galante was held in the Federal Detention Center at 427 West Street, New York, before being sent to Alcatraz, and then to Lewisburg Penitentiary, Leavenworth, and finally Atlanta to serve out his sentence. It would be the longest time he was to spend behind bars. His time in Lewisburg Penitentiary was not totally unpleasant. He had his own cell in G Block, known by the inmates as Mafia Row, and it was here that he developed a lifelong interest and pleasure in growing plants and flowers. He was also allowed 3 cats as company and spent many hours in the prison jail keeping fit. He became a close friend of Jimmy Hoffa and apparently ruled the block with an iron hand. Galante would be released from prison in 1974. Following the Bananas split and the subsequent war and dethroning of Joe Bonanno in the late 1960s, there had been a series of boss replacements in the family. On August 28, 1973, the current head, Natale Evola, died of cancer and was replaced by Philip Rusty Rastelli. When Galante emerged from federal prison, he made it quite clear he wanted to be the boss. Rastelli resisted the move at first, but was forced aside when he went to prison in 1976. At that point, Galante would seize complete control of the family. As unofficial boss, Galante immediately began importing mafiosos from Sicily, or Zips as they were commonly referred to. They spoke only Sicilian and were thought of as more loyal and ruthless than their American counterparts. Carmine Galante then ratcheted up the narcotics trade while plotting war on his rivals. He held the Gambinos in particular contempt because of their long-standing rivalry with the Bonannos and because they had been muscling into the Bonanno drug empire. Throughout the late 70s, he allegedly organized the deaths of at least 8 people associated with the Gambino family drug operation. Galante's brazen attempt to take over the narcotics market and his refusal to share profits had caused alarm and anger amongst the other New York crime families. With his rise to power not sanctioned by the Commission, and with drug dealing being officially banned, Genovese crime family boss Frank Thierry and official Bonanno boss Philip Rastelli felt confident in moving against him. In 1979, official Bonanno boss Philip Rusty Rastelli sought approval from the Commission to have Galante killed. This request was relayed by Rastelli loyalist Joseph Massino, and a contract on Galante was given the green light. For his part, Galante felt untouchable because he had surrounded himself with Sicilian-born bodyguards he felt were loyal to him. So in order to move forward with a hit on Galante, Rastelli and Massino needed the cooperation of the Sicilian Zips, specifically Cesar Bonventre and his cousin Baldo Amato, who together acted as Galante's bodyguards. On July 12, 1979, Galante was dropped off for lunch at Joe and Mary's, an Italian restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. There he dined on an open patio with 2 loyalists, Leonard Coppola, a Bonanno captain, and restaurant owner and cousin, Giuseppe Turano. After a short while, Bonventre and Amato joined Galante. Suddenly and without warning, 3 men wearing ski masks appeared on the patio and opened fire on Galante, Coppola, and Turano with shotguns and handguns. After this, the 3 hitmen ran out of the restaurant. Galante, whose left eye was shot out during the hail of gunfire, and his 2 lunch companions died instantly. A photograph of the murdered Galante showed a cigar still held between his teeth. Bonventre and Amato were left unharmed and seemingly did nothing to protect Galante. The 2 Sicilians were alleged to have joined in the attack before disappearing from the scene. A week after Galante's murder, Bonventre was arrested by federal agents, but he was soon released and was never charged with involvement in the crime. For his betrayal of Galante, Cesar Bonventre was subsequently made a capo in the Bonanno family, the youngest ever at the age of 28. Bonventre soon became a major player in what became known as the Pizza Connection, in which heroin was imported from Sicily and distributed from New York pizza parlors. With the murder of Galante and the affirmation of Rastelli as boss, a period of discontent and rivalry took place within the Bonanno crime family. As a result, Rastelli and Massino started purging their opponents in the organization. In May 1981, 3 Bonanno family capos were murdered by the Massino-Rastelli faction. This rival faction, led by Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giacone, planned a hostile takeover of the family, but were lured to their deaths and taken out in what became known as the 3 Capos murder. By 1984, Bonventre, who had initially supported the three capos before switching sides, was placed on a hit list by Bonanno leaders who considered the young Sicilian a threat to their leadership. He was murdered in 1984, and his remains were later found stuffed inside two 55-gallon glue drums. With Galante's murder, the power of the Bonanno crime family over the course of years was eventually consolidated under Joseph Massino, who by the early 2000s was considered by the FBI to be one of the most powerful mob bosses in the nation. However, Carmine Galante will be remembered as a mobster who scared everyone. His fellow mobsters, the press, civilians, even law enforcement. Ralph Salerno, a former NYPD detective, once said, "Of all the gangsters I've met personally, and I've met dozens of them in all my years, there were only two who, when I looked at them straight in the eye, I decided I wouldn't want them to be really personally mad at me. Anello Della Croce was one, and Carmine Galante was the other. They had bad eyes. I mean, they had the eyes of killers. You could see how frightening they were, the frigid glare of a killer." During his time, Galante wielded enormous power in the Mafia, and did so without a conscience. He was a true psychopath with no emotion or feeling for his fellow man. When you mix power and evil at this high a level, you create Carmine Galante, one of the most feared gangsters of all time.